But this is the Microsoft Technology Update for August 2022. It's been a few months since the last one. I'll apologise for having a holiday, but I did feel the need. As is normally the case, we're talking about a variety of things that have been announced since the last update. But in this case, I'm also going to cover a few deprecations, things that are due to be turned off. We're going to talk about Entra a little, and we'll probably come back to that at the end. We've got a bit about Endpoint Manager and some of the things that are happening there. Quite a lot about changes that have been made to Defender, because some of the changes there are really useful from a management point of view, but also from protection of mobile devices, Macintoshes and the like. We've got a change coming in terms of information protection and sensitivity labeling as relates to SharePoint. And there's a few other interesting bits around Apple integration generally that will scatter through this. But I wanted to start off with words of warning, and it's all about things that are being deprecated. Now, we've been talking about these things for quite a while, but starting in October, and actually on October the 1st, the use of basic and legacy authentication to access Exchange Online is being turned off. The concern really is if you have any service accounts or external services that use email to send out advisories, send out notifications, if they are using legacy authentication, then these may stop working on or around the 1st of October. I know that sounds a bit vague, but Microsoft are rolling this out from the 1st. You could get it on the 1st. It could potentially be the 2nd. It just depends how quickly the implementation rolls. What we don't want is for you suddenly to start losing notifications that are important. You can find out fairly easily what is using basic authentication from looking at the sign-in logs, and there's lots and lots of Microsoft advice on what you can actually do to remove the problem or to switch to some other form of authentication. One of the questions that's come in here is about an MFA exclusion policy set by Azure AD. That's all very well in that you won't be being asked for MFA, but if the application itself is still using the legacy authentication, it will be blocked. So it will no longer be able to gain access. And that's true if it's talking to IMAP, POP3, HTTP, web services. It's not necessarily true for SMTP, but you'll need to read the documentation to actually go through the detail on that. The other thing that's happening, and it's a little bit quicker, so at the end of this month, so you've got 2 weeks, the Azure AD Connect version 1 is going to be retired. Now that means that it will be completely out of support, and if anything breaks, Microsoft will not be helping you to resolve the issue. The reason why it's being retired is that SQL 2012 is falling out of support on that day, and it's one of the components of the Azure AD Connect version 1. We would strongly recommend that before that date, you do an upgrade to version 2. You can do that using a switch upgrade. It's very difficult unless you've got a very modern server to do an in-place upgrade. You can use the Azure AD Connect documentation tools to make sure that the settings are the same. You can also do an export of the current config from version 1 and import that into version 2. So there should be no reason to stop you moving ahead. But it's also worth looking at the fact that in 6 or 7 months' time, Microsoft are also retiring a lot of versions that are 2 or above. So everything from 2.0.3 up to 2.0.89 will also be retired on the 15th of March. Microsoft now have a policy of only supporting AAD Connect that has been released in the last 18 months. So it's well worth just checking your Azure AD Connect boxes and making sure they are up to date. That's also fairly key for some of the things I'm going to talk about in a bit. The biggest announcement or the biggest change that Microsoft have made over the past few months is Entra. And Entra is in effect a brand which is bringing together a number of different systems. And they're systems that we're really familiar with, or at least two of them are. Azure Active Directory and all of its components have been added to the cloud-centric permissions management that's come from the CloudKnox acquisition, and also the verifiable ID or verifiable credentials piece that Microsoft have been working on with Apple and Google over the past number of years. We already know a lot about Azure Active Directory. After all, we've been using it and talking about it for 10, 12 years. It's still going to be available, it's still going to be around, it's not changing massively in terms of what it's actually providing. And it is the identity provider that sits behind all of the things that we use on a regular basis. So it's the identity provider for Office 365 and all of its components. It does give us that provisioning system and single sign-on system for things which are SCIM managed, and provides us with that conditional access. The newest piece of this is permissions management. So this is coming from the CloudKnox acquisition and allows us to view the permissions that are in place and in use by our users against Azure, AWS, and Google. That allows us then to see who has which permissions, how often they use them, whether or not there is actually a gap between what they use and what they have. And that permissions gap is important. Because we're all moving towards a zero trust methodology, we want to make sure that users have just enough administrative power to do their job, and we provision it just in time. That's part of the reason for privileged identity management or privileged access management. If somebody has admin rights in AWS and they don't actually use them for 6 months, the chances are they probably don't need them all the time. Or maybe they only need a part of the admin. By using permissions management, we can see this gap and we can remediate it. We can remove those extra privileges that people have that they don't actually need anymore. The other piece here, of course, is verifiable ID. We have a separate webinar coming up on this next month, which there'll be more details on later on. But it's really about being able to prove to your employer or to somebody else that you have a credential. So let's think about Microsoft certification. I have the AZ500 certification, which means I can talk about Azure security, identity, authentication, probably till the cows come home. But that accreditation is mine. It's used and associated with me as an identity. At the moment, to prove that I have that qualification, I need to go into the Microsoft system. I need to associate my identity with an organization, and they can then view all of the credentials that I have, both current and historic. I might only want to expose the fact that I've got AZ500 just this once. And being able to use verifiable credentials will give me that. So I can take the credential that is provided, I can put it in my wallet, which is actually part of my Authenticator app, and I can choose to share that credential with my employer, so with Cocho. In the same way as when you go to a restaurant and you're paying at the end of the meal, you present the credit card to the machine. Now, the machine doesn't actually understand who you are, it just knows that that credit card is valid, and it checks it, and it links that to your bill so that you've paid. The verifiable credential is provided to your organization, and that organization can check that the credential is valid and link it to your account, to your bill. Now, not everybody has signed up to this yet, but it's coming, and you can see it as being a way of allowing people to say, Yes, I am able to drive a company car. Yes, I am able to do Azure information. Yes, I am able to access this set of information because I've been validated. It's part of Azure Active Directory. It's available now, and it's something you'll be able to use going forwards. When we talk about new things, though, there is a new public preview of certificate-based authentication that's available. Now, I did mention this in the last presentation, and at the time it was fairly limited in terms of what it can do. Some of those limitations are still there. For example, strictly speaking, this is a Windows 11 22H2 implementation, but it does allow us to use an X509 certificate to authenticate the device itself and the user directly against Azure AD. We don't have to use ADFS. We don't have to put anything else in place that's understanding that certificate. It also supports iOS and Android. Now that's fairly new. As long as the certificate is published to the iOS device or the Android device, it should work. Now there are a couple of limitations on this. So first, you need to make sure that the CA, the certificate authority, and any intermediate CAs are published and uploaded to Azure so it can understand exactly what's going on. Your certificate revocation list must also be public, so Azure must be able to check that to make sure that these certificates have not been revoked. Now, what this doesn't do yet, but it's coming, and I'm expecting this to be available at least in preview by the end of the year, is to support those non-routable UPNs. People who are still using Active Directory and smart cards because they have a large on-premises estate may have a UPN that includes company.local as a name. Now that's not really a routable UPN, so it's very difficult for Azure to understand the UPN and be able to relate it to the UPN inside Azure Active Directory. But that support is coming. So where you have a different UPN domain to your main UPN in the cloud, you will be able to now support that. There's also a function that's looking at external smart cards for mobile devices. So this is iOS and Android. Quite how that's going to work, I'm not sure, but it could be an NFC type connection. And there's also going to be changes to the way that CRL limits are implemented. So how many certificates you can revoke at a time and how that revocation will actually come across to those users. There's also been a change, or rather a making generally available, of some cross-tenant access. So we've been talking for a long time about the ability to allow an external organization to access your systems. You could have a Teams site that you want somebody from Cocho to be able to access. Ideally, you invite them using an access package and that creates their identity in your system cleanly. But your system may have a conditional access policy that says only compliant devices and must do MFA. Well, there's a challenge because as a Cocho user, I have my own laptop which is managed by Cocho. Yes, it's compliant, but it's compliant in Cocho terms rather than in your terms. This function will allow you to take an external directory, so Cocho for example, and say, I will trust, because I've looked at it, the compliance statement of your devices in your directory. I will trust the MFA that your users are providing against your directory. So in real terms, because I'm with Cocho, because I'm using a Cocho managed device, and because I have Cocho MFA, and you as an organization trust that, I won't be being asked to provide that MFA every time I try to access the shared Teams site. So what we're doing is we're allowing those CA policies to trust that external environment. And it's done, as you can see from this screenshot, through the trust settings when you create that external identity. We don't have to choose all three. We can say we only want to do multi-factor, or we want to do compliant, or both, or even just Azure AD joined. So we have that flexibility to choose what we're doing. And this is done per organization. So for every organization you're allowing in, you can set this up explicitly for that one. Some of the other things that we've been moaning about for a while include groups. We've, for a long time, wanted to be able to take group information from Azure and write it back to Active Directory. And we've been able to do that using Azure AD Connect for a while, but it's not exactly been very friendly. And the groups that are created inside Azure Active Directory haven't been as flexible as we'd like. Well, that's now changing. We can now create a distribution group, security group, or mail-enabled security group in AD based on what we have in Azure. Now we can set this, what type of group it is, through PowerShell or through the Graph API. But because we're doing that, what it allows us to do is attest the membership of groups inside Azure Active Directory based on the identity governance and the controls that we have in Azure, and have that written back to Active Directory. The groups also will now be provisioned with the display name. So gone are the times when we used to have a group name that was a GUID that was very difficult to actually understand. So I thought I'd just show you what this looks like. And here's a picture of Active Directory users and computers showing the OU I've created for groups synced from Azure. When I go into Azure AD Connect and I start to configure this, inside the group writeback, I've said I want all of these groups written to this specific container. And as you can see at the bottom of this screenshot, we have a tick box to say use the distinguished name with what's the display name in the cloud. When I then turn on Azure AD Connect and run it through a sync cycle, I can then see that groups are added to the relevant container inside AD with a name that at least starts off as something that's intelligible. So all company, retention, AAD administrator users. And you can see that that makes things easier to understand. And because the group type is now something we can set, it becomes much more functional inside Active Directory. When we set this up, we do need to actually modify a bit of Azure AD Connect. And to do that, we use a little bit of PowerShell, which I've put on the screen here. And that basically tells it to run this new environment using the version 2 features of the group writeback. It takes about 5 minutes to get this whole thing up and configured and running, and works really, really well. The other change that we have in groups is we now have the ability to have nested groups in Azure Active Directory. Now, that Azure nested group doesn't work quite the same way as it did in Active Directory. In Active Directory, you would go into the group, the master group, and you would add in the nested groups. So when you looked, all you would actually see is the names of the nested groups. In Azure Active Directory, we do this using a dynamic membership. But instead of saying, I want this to be people who are in department IT, we actually say, I want this to be users who are a member of, and we name the group. So group 1 here and group 2. And we do this using a dynamic query. Now that dynamic query is going to be quite interesting because we're actually going to use the user object ID, so the group object ID, as part of the query. And this is actually fairly obvious because we're using that because the group ID is never changing, whereas the text name may change depending on your language. So we need to make sure that these features are available. One of the other things that is coming, and this isn't going to be available for a while, relates to the way that Apple, and specifically Mac, is used against Azure. For a long time, we've had the ability inside Windows to sign on first to the device and then seamlessly be able to access Azure. And that feature hasn't really been available in Mac because things have been a bit disconnected. So Apple and Microsoft have been working together, and they're bringing some new features into the next release of the Mac OS. So this is OS 13, the Ventura build. And within here, we're going to actually support authentication from the initial sign-on directly against Azure Active Directory. That will give you support for that primary refresh token on a Mac. So when you then go into a browser and you access Office 365 or any other Azure services, it will give you that same seamless single sign-on. That single sign-on then becomes something that the users will really enjoy. It's still going to be going through conditional access, so you may have services which will be protected by MFA, but that's absolutely fine. It's exactly the way we work on Windows. Now, Mac OS 13 is scheduled to be released in September. We expect the announcement of availability either on the 6th or the 13th, and of public availability is normally about a week after that. But certainly from the Apple point of view, it's a great step forward. We've got a real change in terms of Endpoint Manager and some of the printing functionality. So as of now, we can now configure the universal print functionality and push this down to a workstation. And this uses a CSP, so it's very, very easy to do and allows us to install or uninstall printers on Windows 11 devices. This will push the relevant driver down to the device and allow the user to print to any universal printer that they are configured with access to. So obviously there are some prerequisites here. So you need to have universal print installed. You need to have an Intune because you need to push this out. And therefore, everything that you would get in the E3 license. You need to be able to administer it, but that's fairly obvious. And you must have already created the printers and shared access before you can configure this. But to me, those are all fairly obvious and things that really didn't need saying. But got to take it from the documentation. Defender for Endpoint has probably had more changes. We're going to start off in the mobile view and actually just have a look at what's available. So with iOS and Android, Defender's been available for a while, but it now has the ability to actually scan mobile wireless networks. So when you're sitting in the local coffee shop and you've connected to its Wi-Fi, you don't normally know whether there's something like a Pineapple device or a listener sitting in the background monitoring what's going on. Defender will now actually scan that network. It doesn't do it at a high priority, it's just sitting in the background, so it's not really noticeable to the user. But when it detects some kind of listener, it will produce an option for the user to switch networks. It will also send an alert through to the Defender console, allowing the admins to actually take note of that. Now, it's quite often difficult if you're in a coffee bar to switch networks to something that's a little more secure. But this is the time when you turn on your VPN and make sure that you are not exposing anything that you wouldn't like exposed to that main Wi-Fi. It's also useful to be able to see the health of your devices. And these are accessed through the security portal, and it's a couple of new reports that Microsoft made available this week. We've always been able to see the device health by looking at a specific device, but now we can look at this overall. The reports are tabbed. So the first report looks at the sensor health and the operating environment. And you can see here that I've got some Windows devices which are being monitored. And we've got information about the versions, the types of information, whether it's the health of the sensor or the operating system itself. So it gives us a lot of information about what's going on. It's quite interesting here to look at the fact that there are over 75 inactive sensors, and that's something that this organization really needs to go and have a look at. It could be that those sensors have just been on servers which have been turned off and the sensor hasn't been removed. or it could be that it's been deactivated maliciously, and we need to actually investigate that. The other tab tells us about the Microsoft Defender antivirus, and it actually tells us which build or which set of heuristics is actually being used actively on our devices. So we can have a look back at the Windows devices and see the current set, a previous set, and potentially there are others behind. So here we've got 72 devices which are using something older than 1.373.368. So those really need to be updated fairly urgently. We can also see that we've got no Linux and no Mac devices here. If we did have, then they'd appear quite cleanly. We can also see that we've done quite a lot of scanning, and only a small number have actually been cancelled. So this is all useful information to actually understand what's going on. Going back to Mac, the Defender for Mac OS has now been extended. Now, it used to be that you could tamper with a Mac implementation. You could go into where the install files are and edit them, delete them, modify them in some way. So if somebody tried to uninstall Defender, that wouldn't actually be noticed. So that's now been changed, and Defender will now log and audit attempts to uninstall it, attempts to modify any of the Defender for Endpoint files, and any creation of new files that are under the installation locations. Now, that doesn't include update files. So if Defender itself is doing an update, it knows that the file is correct and therefore will not trigger any notification, because that's the sort of thing that you'd expect it to be going on. So I said there was only really one thing in terms of purview and compliance, and that's the fact that Microsoft announced the general availability of SharePoint sensitivity labeling for files. And this is in preview now, is due to go GA in October. And it allows you to basically add a default sensitivity label per system, per library. Now, what will happen there is when a new file is created or an existing file without a label is edited, a label will automatically be assigned to that file. It will not change the current label of a file. So if I create a file and I designate it as sensitivity public, it will not be updated by the SharePoint default because I as a user have requested this. However, if I create a new file and don't label it, then it will automatically be labeled with that default. Very much the same way as the retention labels are applied against files today. The only downside of this is that it's going to require a premium license in order to operate. And I'm not 100% sure what that premium license is going to be, whether it's a SharePoint license or whether it's an information protection license. I'm thinking more information protection, but this is still to be confirmed. So that's the last of the slides. I'm just going to remind you that there is this verified identities, verifiable credentials demo, and it's happening on the 14th of September, hosted by Marcus Idle. So please, if you're interested in that, have a look and figure out exactly how this could change the way that you're handling things. If anything I've said has been quite interesting and you want to talk about it in more detail, give us a call. There's an email address and a phone number on the screen now, and we'll be happy to arrange a vision call with you. And just before I go, we've got a couple of questions through the chat that is worth going to. The first one's relating to external organizations and using their compliance. When you work with an external organization, particularly when we're talking about them sharing information with you, there is a degree of due diligence that you should be going through. And that should mean asking them, do they have compliance settings and would they mind sharing them with you? If they do, and you like the compliance settings because they are at least on a par with yours or best practice, then you can turn the compliance on. If not, you probably wouldn't do that. And I think it's worth remembering that when we're talking about security, due diligence is vitally important. There has to be something we can use to measure the amount of trust we have in an organization or a user before we actually allow people to do things. If you do trust somebody and you're controlling their access and you're taking the compliance that they have, then that's great. It could be that it's actually a different part of your organization that just happens to have a separate tenant and you're managing it directly, in which case compliance becomes something that you probably need to turn on. The other question that I've got is relating to inadvertent changes, renames and deletes for a group written back from AAD. So if we're using the group write back, we're generally going to be managing this group inside AAD rather than inside Active Directory. So you need to make sure that your admins are aware, that they know that if they're going to be changing group information, then Azure is the place to do it, rather than doing it in Active Directory. And the same controls should be there. If somebody inadvertently deletes one, we go to the recycle bin and bring it back. If they rename it, well, it'll be renamed on both sides. And of course, group names in Active Directory aren't actually what gets used. The SID is what gets used, and that hasn't changed. So that side of it should all still be working well. Hopefully that's answered the questions. If not, drop us an email and we'll do our best to give you a bit more detail, or arrange the vision call and we'll go from there. So with that, I'd like to thank you for paying attention for the last 35 minutes, and I'll hope to see you on the next webinar. Thank you.